Hi there, gang, and welcome to episode 3 of the Racing Central podcast, where simmers of yore talk in a grizzled room and sit in darkness. I'm John Denton, and with me once again I have Simon Croft and Tim Wheatley. So here we are again, Tim. It seems like people are actually listening to us.
Yeah, it's been quite nice to see some of the stats and things. It's because you're on every platform, it's a little bit spread out, so sometimes it's a bit hard to get an idea of numbers, but it's nice to see them actually going up.
How are things going, Simon?
Yeah, not so bad. It's nice to be back here. I can't believe another month's passed, but we'll be doing the Christmas special soon, no doubt.
Can't wait. Okay, so we're going to jump right in today with Tim and Simon's subjects of discussion, because we haven't really been doing that much simming in the last month. So Tim, do you want to get us started, get the ball rolling?
Yeah, well, we were just kind of talking the other day, and I brought up a Papyrus software build that I got access to, and if I go back to an interview that I did with Richard Yazzie, who used to work for Papyrus, he drew up a Grand Prix Legends 1972 simulation, and I now have access to a really early build of that. And so does everyone else, actually. It's actually been on the internet for a little while, because it's what Sean Nash also used as his testbed for the Xbox. So if you've seen an Xbox build hanging around, which had the NASCAR Racing 4 car body, but the Grand Prix Legends tracks in it, that's actually the 1972 Grand Prix Legends build.
So the build has you driving around in a bodied NASCAR that actually handles like a Lotus 72 or something.
Yep.
Interesting. I'm surprised more people aren't aware of this, because for a very long time GPL2 was on the tip of everyone's tongue, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was, we wrote letters to Sierra, who obviously will have just laughed at that and, done absolutely nothing with it, and all sorts of things to try to make this happen. But yeah, it was actually a thing that they put at least some amount of effort into. And I actually thought that it was a kind of weird build, or it was just a test build that they had done, specifically for the Xbox. But when I asked someone who works at iRacing about that particular build, they said that it was the 72 build.
That's crazy, really. And so if we can imagine what GPL 1972 would have been about, I'm guessing we'd have a very much closer field than in 1967, and probably a group of cars that were all going to have quite similar performance levels to run closely together. So the question is, why haven't they made this sim now? We need to start writing a letter to iRacing, don't we now?
Well, I think unfortunately the reason why a lot of historic simulations just don't get made is because the publishers are scared of them, and that kind of leads on to my topic, which is sort of wishlist simulations, and the things that we would like to build if we were in a position where we won the lottery and could fund a studio for a few years or something like that. What would we want to get made?
I think you'd have to hope to assume that licensing is not an issue as well, because I guess now, if iRacing decided they wanted to make a GPL2 right now, or indeed just do a modern remake of GPL, like we're seeing a lot of modern remakes of games, aren't we? The licensing would obviously be an issue for the F1 cars in it and F1 circuits.
Well, to be fair, Grand Prix Legends didn't have an F1 license. It just had the cars and tracks. And a notable piece of trivia is that Honda actually did say yes, but they were too late.
And so that's why we got the Murasama.
So that's why we got the But yeah, they didn't have an F1 license, and also the current owners of F1 don't own anything before, I think, 1988 or somewhere around there, with the FISA FOCA, wars.
Right. Yeah. No, that's right. Because I think that if you're on F1 TV, they have all of the old races available, don't they? But they only go back so far.
Yeah. They have to license anything that's outside of their ownership.
So I mean, that suggests that it's not gonna be impossible to make such a game nowadays.
No, I think it's absolutely possible. You could go and you can license all of the individual cars and tracks, and I don't think you would have that much of a problem with that. And I don't think the user would have a problem with it. It's I know that Bernie did try to copyright Grand Prix in the past, but obviously that's really difficult for him to say that he owns. Yeah, but yeah, that's why you'll see a lot of descriptive use of things as being Grand Prix cars rather than F1 cars is because it's something that you can still say. Yeah.
If we're putting licensing to one side and stuff, or it's maybe not an issue though, are you thinking of this as in, you're saying, right, you've won the lottery, you can make what you want. Are you thinking just for yourself to have it on your hard drive at home, or to actually see it released as a title?
No, I would definitely want to see it released. I think we're a very similar bunch when it comes down to it. I think there's a lot of people that want the same kind of things. And while you two might have different ideas of what you would make, to me, I think there's definitely people out there that would want the same thing that I want.
So come on and hit us with it. What's your dream sim then, Tim?
Well, I actually have a few. I would really like to see a proper remake of Spirit of Speed. I think there's definitely something to be said about the 30s. And then the 50s, the Sterling Moss era. And then I would desperately like to see a really good remake of Grand Prix Legends. I'd go back to 67 again. And then actually, I'd like to see 1991. The Formula One Grand Prix season, just basically rebuilt in a modern guise. And then, other than that, the thing that I really would like to see almost a remake again is 1994 NASCAR. There was a tire war. There was two different tires, one of which basically couldn't lap Daytona without failing. But it was, that's a typical tire war, pretty much. Yeah. And yeah, it just the way that the cars drove and the nostalgia is a really big factor with all of my picks there. I think just the nostalgia of that era. It was the end of the Dale Earnhardt era and the beginning of the Jeff Gordon era. So it was just a really, really special season.
The interesting thing though is that a number of your picks there were things, they predate you. So it's not just about nostalgia. Mm-hmm. Taking let's say the 1953 F1 season, you never went to any of those races. You never saw it. So you have a nostalgia that's come from your interest and study of the sport and so on. And when we got Grand Prix Legends in 1998, I don't know about you, but I knew a lot about Formula One, but I didn't know a lot about Formula One in the 60s. And that game actually piqued my interest in learning more and more. And like Steve Smith's manual, particularly reading that, gave me a lot of information that I didn't know about. And it actually, I became far more interested in that era of Formula One racing as a result of the game. You mentioned earlier that publishers or game developers might be a little bit scared of historic content, in the sense that the more modern stuff certainly gets more interest from maybe the majority, probably certainly from younger players, who may look at, say, even a 1991 Formula One car, for instance, and that's well before they were born, and what do they know about it? I don't know what my question is really. It's sort of like, they're fearful of historic content, but if you look at people like you and I, Tim, we became interested in the historic content because of the quality of the sim that was GPL, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And therefore, creating something. I mean, I think GPL is a difficult one because it didn't sell that well on release, but despite that, 25 years on, people are still playing it every week, right? And there aren't many sims that you can say that for.
Yeah, I do. I do think we have to think about the fact that Grand Prix Legends was probably only sold for 2 or 3 years as well. Every single modern simulator is a sort of 10-year project, and it makes me wonder whether if someone built a platform that was truly based around historic racing and the cars that, in my opinion, are just so much more fun to drive, whether it wouldn't be successful. I actually think that it would, and it's a little bit frustrating that it's there's just this constant flow towards modern GT3.
I think in a way the Gran Turismo series offers an interesting parallel there as well, in that actually a lot of the cars from that series were not cars that people, say in the UK, knew about or had a huge love for, but actually a huge amount of interest then developed in them from those games. And some of that is sort of, relative to the time of release, older cars, so somewhat historic or retro. But a lot of it's just, you expose people to new things, you're going to find a new market for it, and people aren't going to fall in love with or passionate about something they don't see. So I can understand how, from a publisher point of view, I'm sure if you crunch the numbers, there is more appeal out there if you stick out F1 2024 than if you stick out F1 1979. But, there's plenty of games out there and plenty of people buying them, and there's plenty of market spaces to kind of segment or create, I think.
Yeah, and that is an interesting thing too, because if you think about just the risk versus reward, you can look at, because it's public, on the fact that Codemasters had to secure like $100 million worth of investment right before they got the F1 license. And if you're going out and you're licensing like a 1972 Lotus and stuff like that, in comparison to licensing modern F1, it's so much less of a risk. And the potential reward is still actually there. You could get a really well-selling product.
Well, and these cars still exist to be able to model them as well. There's a lot of, the 1930s stuff would be more difficult, but a lot of those cars still exist, and a lot of them are still running. You even see them at historic events, like Goodwood and so on.
I think if you look at something like Automobilista, which obviously took a bit of a niche approach of a lot of its sort of Brazilian-based content, not necessarily talking about historic here, but just, it's not stuff that you see everywhere else, and the quality of the title still wins through, and, again, you find a new market, you find new fans for something that they otherwise wouldn't see.
I think Automobilista 2 of the modern Sims is the one doing the most of this, though, because they're continually releasing not only old historic cars, Group C cars, and historic F1 cars, and other categories. They are releasing older versions of the circuits when they release them, and I think that's a really nice touch. You don't just get Spa, but you get Spa, modern Spa, you get 1990 Spa, you get Spa from the 1960s as well, and they're obviously different versions, quite radically different versions, so it's not just like a reskin of the track. For the team have to do a lot of work on that.
Yeah, I had this grand dream with R Factor 2 of kind of making it into a lot of my kind of wish list, and it just none of it went forward. But I had, like I've said before, the 1966 cars. I had contact with everyone that I wanted to license. I had them all lined up to license, and that just never went ahead. Although we did license the Dan Gurney's Eagle, which was never built. and I also did the same for the Indy 500 as well. I had the 95 Reynard. I had the 86 March, which were kind of the typical cars of their era, and then I had the 1968 Eagle, which won. Was talking to Lotus about these 65 Lotus. I had the 1961 Cooper, which was the first rear-engine car there. I had the AJ Watson Roadster, which was the big front-engined car.
Abomination.
But yeah, I really wanted to make a kind of through the ages kind of Indy 500
well, I mean,
selection.
And this is Automobilista 2 has a number of those cars. The 95 Reynard is in there, for instance. And
yeah, exactly.
It's great that they picked up your baton, clearly. But no, I mean, it's about the tracks as well. You know, like I've been racing the Lotus 79 in iRacing, and I think that's a great car, and I think the Lotus 49 in iRacing is good as well. I don't think of all the cars in Grand Prix Legends, I kind of dislike the Lotus 49 to drive the most, but for what that car represents, it's a great car. But the biggest problem in iRacing is that you're racing them on modern circuits, and it doesn't fit in your mind, you know, and especially, you know, this week, for instance, myself and a fellow racer were talking about Jerez. We were at the circuit of Jerez, and it's got so much runoff here and there, and you can go incredibly wide out of corners, and it just seems like when you go to other circuits, maybe like Brands Hatch or Alton Park or things like that, where it doesn't have that, they're much more sort of old school circuits, you get a much better feeling of what it was like to race these cars. But then when you jump into something like Automobilista 2 or Assetto Corsa's got some historic tracks as well, you get a much better feel for the era, similar to how you did with GPL, where it's like you feel like you're taking part in a Grand Prix in 1967 or whenever, you know, like another point as well there on Assetto Corsa, of course, Tim, you mentioned the 50s, and this was going to be my next point, is about difficulty. Obviously the fear of difficulty came from GPL because it became one of those, it's definitely one of those sims that you have to work really hard at, and there's a V12 Maserati 250F in Assetto Corsa that I think it's superb, but I think it might be possibly one of the most difficult cars in all of sim racing to drive. You know, it's got these sort of horse and cart size wheels, and is that a concern? I think, you know, when you look at the historic series that iRacing run, both for the Lotus 79, as I mentioned, the Lotus 49, they also have a Group C car, Nissan ZX-T. They're very small communities. They don't get a huge amount of participation, and part of that is because it's going to take you a good few hours in the car to get yourself up to speed. It's not the sort of thing you can just jump into.
But is that an issue of selection? I think, you know, we may have even said in the last episode that, you know, if something has too many cars, you know, you can always hop to a car that you find easier, and that might be kind of part of the problem, is that you can go and you can find a car that you're instantly better at, makes you feel better about yourself, or you can actually be challenged and try to beat that, which is something that we've also talked about in the past.
Get to feel bad about yourself instead.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think there's something to be said for having a field full of cars like it was in Grand Prix Legends. You know, you would have all of the races at like Monza, for example, because it had basically like 4 right turns and then flat lefts, and you would have everybody in the Lotus 49. And there was me in the Honda, and one of the primary reasons why I would drive it is to make them feel worse about themselves when I beat them.
That's so kind.
Yeah, it really there's definitely something to be said about car selection there, because if you have the option to go and drive the Lotus, there's a huge amount of people that are going to go and do that. And I think that's the same thing that happens on a grander scale with the series. People are going to go and race a different iRacing series that they can feel better about themselves in.
GT3 cars, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Just going back to your point, John, about like historic tracks and historic cars together, and you sort of saying that gives you a better feel. There's also obviously the reality that those cars were developed to race in the environments they had at the time, and so I'm thinking about kind of this dream sim thing. One, perhaps unsurprisingly, my mind went to kind of rallying and rallycross, and a lot of people hold the Group B era as the kind of golden era of rallying, but Group B cars are completely ill-suited to a lot of the stages that have come since, because they're just not equipped to handle them. They didn't have a handbrake that you could use. That's why they always do 3-point turns or really awkward scrapes around the wall on a hairpin, for example. So when you think about, say, the Group B cars that have been in modern titles, rally titles, often they're stuck on just modern stages. And it's not to say you can't drive them on there. It's not to say you couldn't do that today in real life, just like you couldn't take a Lotus 79 and drive it around modern Monza or something if you had the money and the time and stuff. But really, if you want to enjoy Group B rally cars, you need era accurate stages to drive them on.
Yeah.
And I do think it goes beyond feel. It's also actually kind of, there's no point taking a Peugeot 205 T16 around a go-kart track. It's not going to give you, you're not sampling it in its sort of natural environment, as it were.
Didn't Rally Trophy have Lancia Stratos at the top when you had to complete the game almost, didn't you, to get to that level?
I was just actually reading an article on Rally Trophy on how the press hated it because it was difficult.
Yeah.
Classic.
Yeah. And I mean, this is your other problem. Sure, like you might not get the publisher or funding behind a sim if it's looking like it's going to be difficult or challenging. You also may not get the press on your side. And I think the mainstream video game press anyway they largely turned away from sim racing, I think, as a niche market. They will cover games like Gran Turismo, they'll cover Forza, but it's they will talk about Assetto Corsa Competizione, they'll talk about the release. You'll see on somewhere like Rock Paper Shotgun, for instance, or Eurogamer. Now, Eurogamer was better coverage generally, but they would say, this game has been released, and there may not be a full review of it because they haven't got the personnel to cover it, but also they don't, I guess, figure that much of their audience are looking at it.
Yeah, press coverage is an interesting thing. As I've kind of looked back through the history of sim racing and like media coverage and stuff, there's probably only been 3 people that have reviewed the greatest sims of all time. If people like them didn't exist, I kind of wonder how the genre would have done, compared to how it did. I mean, it never really set the world alight in terms of sales, but if people like Andy Mahood and people like that weren't actually around to review and actually give these sims a chance with the difficulty that they actually presented to the user, I mean, I don't really know how the genre would have done.
But that said, in the 90s, I was looking through some old issues of PC Zone magazine recently, perversely, and it was interesting how much coverage there was of not only every IndyCar Racing 2, NASCAR Racing, they're all getting the full review treatment and everything. They maybe even be mentioned on the front cover and things like that. But the whole market for PC games at the time was much, much, much smaller. Nowadays, so many games are released every month that a title like PC Gamer has to pick and choose what they're going to review. Whereas I feel like in those days, they were more likely looking at the release schedule and saying, what else are we going to fill the rest of the pages of the magazine up with?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting there is that like if you look at the press release for the NVIDIA NV1, which was their first ever graphics chip, they have a quote from Dave Kamer in there.
Yeah.
And what's been really what's happened again and again and again is that it's sim racing developers that historically broke ground on new tech, new features, supporting this stuff, and it really.
And I think flight sims as well.
Yeah, but it's simulation that's really kind of pushed the edges of what a system could do. Like we've all kind of had the era where basically we couldn't have nice graphics because the computer was too busy doing the physics. Which I think we've actually left now. Like I don't think that's actually a thing anymore. And if anybody says that, they're wrong. But yeah, it kind of. It is really interesting how often really good racing sims actually broke new ground in some way that really wasn't related to simulation at all, but it was something that was completely new. And I don't know if that might lead into Simon's topic.
Possibly so. That's a beautiful segue. So, yeah, I can't remember what I was thinking about specifically. I think it was I was thinking about VR, but basically there's a topic I want to discuss today is kind of loosely call it game changers, and it's things. It could be kind of technology, or titles or features that have for us really kind of changed our sort of experience and the outlook on when it comes to simming, and then also kind of it got me thinking about looking forward. What's possibly on the horizon. So I mean, there's a few kind of, to give some sort of starters. There's a few sort of obvious ones. So you two have talked about some of the really old titles that you've played or been playing, and obviously kind of that predates even using a wheel. Well, I suppose it's not actually that far back if you're talking about kind of a PlayStation on the pad and stuff. But for me now, if I'm talking simming, then obviously something like force feedback with a wheel is kind of, it's there's no sort of, it's not an option not to use those things. What I was really surprised about, and I heard other people say this, I think I heard you say it, John, was that, so I was relatively late in a sense, and given it's still a fairly niche thing into VR, and I basically got very generously gifted one of the original Rift units. And when I first tried it, it was kind of what I was expecting, but at the same time, it sort of impressed me in ways that I don't think any words could have really kind of conveyed. And then I just very quickly realized that I don't think I can play racing sims without VR.
You can't go back to Pancake.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I remember I had an old Track IR unit, the kind of head tracking thing, which gave a little bit of a taste of this in a sense, but it also never worked. As in, not that it technically didn't work, but for me, the experience of turning your head, but then having to turn your eyes to stay looking in the same direction kind of was quite unnatural.
You didn't feel, I don't think you felt anchored to the car in Track IR. I think it worked very good for flight sims.
Yeah.
But like, even still in flight sims, where you need to understand, say, where the car is sliding, and where you're looking relative to that sliding, it wasn't clear on a flat screen with Track IR, I think.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've realised with the things where I've said, oh yeah, no, that for me is kind of, once you've gone there, you can't sort of go back. There's sort of two things. In a perhaps obvious sense, it's things that basically move you towards realism. It's much more realistic to be using a wheel with force feedback than to be using keys on a keyboard. It's much more realistic to be using VR and have like a 3D environment you can look around in rather than looking at a pancake, as you put it. But I think it's also kind of about what makes it a much more natural experience. It's where you're not having to sort of suspend your belief, or you're not having to kind of mentally make the transition of, right, I'm playing a game, but I'm kind of going to make, in my head, I'm going to convince myself I'm not all of these things are things that basically much more replicate the real life experience in a way whereby it's much easier to lose yourself in what you're doing. You can go and drive around and you are highly immersed, and when you take a headset off after 45 minutes and you're sweating and everything else, you kind of almost, I find like, oh yeah, I'm sat here, I forgot about that. And they're things that I find really hard now to think about not having as part of the experience. And then when it comes to kind of more of the software or feature side, there's a number of things. I think like laser scanned tracks have really pushed the envelope hugely when it comes to accuracy. I do think I could live without them. I do think I could still drive and enjoy a title that perhaps even had a wildly inaccurate track, just as long as I wasn't trying to convince myself it was the real track and just said it's a track, this is my playground sort of thing.
Well, I think what it is that the fidelity of laser scan tracks raised an expectation now. So if you have a track that is not laser scanned, but still very high fidelity in terms of there are cambers, there are bumps, there are even grooves that you can feel in the track. I think that laser scan tracks actually drove forward tyre modelling in the sense that before we had such fidelity on the track surface, the tyre model was getting away with a lot more, and the fidelity of the surface started to highlight problems with the tyre model, which were, there's, for instance, if there's a steep crest that's highlighting the load change, you could shave that crest down, whereas if you're sticking with the point cloud for the laser scan, then you've got to do it as it is.
I actually wonder on that, because I've thought for a long time. Like if you take R Factor 1, for example, and you put a laser scan track in it, which there was a couple for R Factor 1, or you took iRacing's laser scan and were able to put it into NASCAR 2003. I actually wonder how much difference people would actually be able to feel.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, you see, because I think the early days of iRacing wasn't radically different to NASCAR Racing 2003. I know that's not a fashionable thing to say.
Yeah.
And I think that was possibly where I'm getting the example that it started to highlight some of the problems. Maybe less so on some of the oval tracks, I'm not sure. But certainly Lime Rock was one of the early tracks in iRacing, and some of the issues with the physics that I'm sure they'd been developed but were more or less lifted and shifted from NASCAR Racing 2003 were being highlighted by that track alone, where it's got the steep drop-offs and occasional cambers and things like that were causing issues on the tyre model, and probably led it on to David Kamer then developing the tyre model to what it's become today. I think that's an interesting point, that if you were to take the laser scan track and put it into an old sim like, let's say, Netcar Pro, it's an open question mark as to whether it would suddenly elevate that sim to being even better. I think it would in certain respects, but I think then there'd be other respects where you would highlight issues with Netcar Pro that you never realised were there, because the tracks that were in it never really showed them.
You can imagine quite easily that the frequency rate at which dampers are being modelled and things like that in the older titles when they were lower are suddenly going to become much more problematic, where you've not got a polygon representing 2 square meters of track, but suddenly it's representing a small shift in kind of a strip of new asphalt that's being laid down or something like that. But it's, in terms of your point, John, about kind of it's not necessarily, I think your point is that it's not necessarily the accuracy as actually how realistic the surfaces are and stuff. I think a good example there is Richard Burns Rally, which obviously we've spoken about before, and that has kind of real stages, but they're not laser scanned. They're not sort of to that sort of level of precision. But what Richard Burns Rally did, I think no title before that had done when it came to kind of roads and loose surfaces and stuff, was it had accurate kind of road profiles, the camber and the crown of the road, and that's absolutely fundamental to the experience. You would not be able to drive that game realistically if it didn't have that realistic track profile, because you wouldn't be able to use the slopes to turn the car and stuff.
Yeah, that's a massive point, and yeah, that really does highlight the fact that, you know, the track changes towards laser scan or just realism, you know, was massively important. If you think about the Colin McRae Rally franchise, for example, I remember one of the stages there was kind of 5-6 cars wide.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be a regular road, you know, with one lane going each way. And yeah, the fact that Richard Burns Rally basically gave you this little sort of claustrophobic strip of, you know, surface to actually drive on was really massive. And yeah, I think the evolution of tracks has been massively important, probably, in my opinion anyway, more than physics within the last 20 years, because like I say, I don't know really how much advancement there's been since R Factor 1, since NASCAR 2003, in the actual underlying physics. You know, they've maybe upped their rates and things like that, but I think you could probably just make some really minor changes to something that ran on a kind of 500 megahertz potato, you know, and put it on a modern system, up its data rates, and get something actually really impressive out of it.
Yeah, I mean, that comes down to the question of how it feels rather than whether it's accurate or not, though, doesn't it, necessarily? Mm. And I think there's an awful lot more nowadays going on under the skin, certainly in a few of the sims, that you don't necessarily feel or aren't necessarily 100% aware of unless you're really digging into the details. But yeah, I mean, you know, the reality is that if you take Grand Prix Legends out for a drive now, or NASCAR Racing 2003, or Netcar Pro, or I guess even like GTR2, then you're going to have an enjoyable time. Those sims, they do feel good. They feel like driving cars. So.
Yeah.
The other area I was thinking of with tracks that was really a sort of a big game changer, and this is where, you know, again, it's maybe not in the vehicle simulation, it's more in the simulation of the environment. Is Real Road, as it's called in R Factor, Live Track, as it's called elsewhere. I don't know, the implementation of the wider environment, you know, the influence of temperature on the track, the influence of build-up of grip from running on the track, marbles, etc., etc. I mean, I think the marbles are a kind of minor point of it, really. It's more how the track can feel different in different temperature conditions. Obviously, it changes the performance as well. You know, the lap times you're able to extract from it. This actually changed the game in quite an interesting way. There are two things, really, that could have been seen as detrimental. Well, there's one thing could be seen as detrimental, which is that, you know, in terms of sheer motor racing and racing pleasure, you have the concept that the track might be less grippy offline, which makes it more difficult to overtake. I remember people complaining about that with live track. But to me, it's as somebody who's raced on real tracks, it's a huge step forward in realism, because this is how tracks really go. But something I always used to remember, certainly in the GPL VROC days, there used to be, I can't remember, it was maybe on VROC, there used to be like these league tables of lap times on each circuit, and you could see whenever somebody set a faster time, and everybody would just be hot lapping all the time. And because the circuits were static and the cars were static, the performance, you could measure your performance directly against everybody. Whereas now, when you see that comparison within iRacing, on Garage 61 or whatever, they have to detail this lap time was set with this track condition, in this temperature, with this relative humidity, wind in this direction. All of those things are influencing that potential lap time. But it comes down. It establishes the reality that just setting that one peak lap time is not what motor racing is about. I think in the past with sim racing, hot lapping used to be a very big thing because of that, and it still is a big thing, I think, but it's just has less relevance really. You look at somebody setting that peak time and you go, okay, but they made sure the conditions were 100% perfect for performance, and that's not reality. If I'm going to race on a circuit, I'm going to automatically generate the conditions, and I'm going to have to deal with what I get.
Yeah, the only real hot lapping that I see now is the F1 series, and that kind of drives me a little bit crazy. Not that the actual people setting the world records do this, but there's with F1 21 and I think every title before that, if you locked the title to a lower frame rate, then the curbs were flat. And it just would drive me a little bit crazy, kind of.
That's a little bit different to just setting the temperature as low as it'll go or anything.
Yeah, you're literally driving a different track to everybody else.
Do the F1 games have any live track technology or anything?
I think they just brought it in, but it's not actually putting the marbles and things where the actual racing line is correctly. So I think it's pre-baked.
Yeah.
So they're basically going back to 2004 with GTR tech there. So yeah.
Shade.
I mean, not to say that it's not difficult to do it. In the way that I think R Factor 2 did it first, which was Terence Groening. I think when that was first announced and it came out, everybody was really excited about it. And like you said, there's a lot more realism in that.
Yeah.
But kind of going back to my Wishlist thing and how the publisher might be afraid of things being too difficult. The track evolution during an event added a massive layer of difficulty that I think a lot of sim racers still have a massive problem with, because they kind of expect to be able to go into the turn and do the same thing that they did last time. It kind of.
But right now they're not getting that, though. In modern sims now, are they? Automobilista 2, iRacing, Assetto Corsa Competizione. In iRacing, a cloud can come over, and the feeling of the track, depending on the car and how critical it will be for that car, the feeling of the track can change quite a lot.
Yeah, I just remember a lot of the kind of almost like support issues is, why wasn't I able to do this? And it was, because your tires were cold, or it was because the track wasn't rubbered in, and it was again and again and again and again.
The age-old problem of assuming that a problem with the either user or the or actual real-life physics is a problem with the sim, like a bug.
Yeah,
it's a very busy. It's
an
assumption people make.
Yeah, on that topic though, and thinking of the parallel when we're talking about perhaps publishing more niche or less popular content, but then you create the market. When you introduce a feature like this and get a load of people saying, why is this happening? Why is that happening? I imagine there's a sort of growing pain there, but there's a learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
And then once people are aware of this and understand it, they know. Yeah. And they'll know it when it happens again. And so it's a transition, basically, of, look, you've had it your way all this time, and now it's changing, and you're going to have to learn.
And then people will always go to the forum and ask the question and always be told to use the search facility.
Yeah.
and get no help at all.
Yeah.
I mean, on that point, though, I mean, going back to Grand Prix Legends again, I mean, that's why for a long time everybody in sim racing thought that difficulty meant realistic. Is because Grand Prix Legends was the benchmark and it was difficult. But yeah, it took a while. It even took me a while to get from the fact that I couldn't go into the middle of a turn and brake, in Grand Prix Legends because the car was going to swap ends. And yeah, just kind of that step and people having to get used to the step of a track not having grip all of a sudden, and stuff like that. It really was difficult for people.
I think what it is though is about education and it's a learning process. So it seems it's not really something that's difficult if you understand what's happening, right? So
Yeah.
This is why Sims in the old days used to have a doorstep manual, and because they would explain all these things in detail. And, if you look at the manual for IndyCar Racing 1, it explains a great deal of stuff in there. And Steve Smith's manual, as I mentioned, with GPL does as well. And similar to you in GPL, I probably spent hour after hour crashing for long enough before I actually read that Steve Smith manual, right? It's 100 pages or whatever, and I was not going to sit down and read 100 pages before I started driving the sim, was I?
No, I mean, and what it comes down to in the end, I think, is the fact that people figure out racing sims by going over the limit and then coming back down to it rather than working up.
Which is the opposite of what people do in real life, yeah.
Yeah. So, and if you worked up to the grip level on a changeable racetrack, then you'd be absolutely fine. But that's not how historically sim racers and gamers have actually done it.
And perhaps the irony there is that actually, if you make it more realistic and sort of quote unquote hard in a sense of being punishing, perhaps then it would create that mindset of, let's build up to it rather than, we've smashed, just reset and off we go. And this takes us back to a previous conversation. If you crash, I don't suppose any publisher's going to release this game. But if you crash and then you can't play the game for a week because your car's getting repaired,
this is my wish list sim.
Next time you go out on track, you might be a bit more hesitant. But
yeah,
I do think, just generally, actually, in terms of, I mean, some of these things are about kind of, I guess it's framed under the conversation we're having about features, but it's also just learning how to drive. I remember it was in playing Sims where I realised a bit sort of by myself and also in conjunction with reading comments that, for example, when you understeering, you don't just put more lock on, you open up the steering a bit to regain the grip. And it's one of these things where it's a bit like learning to ride a bike. When you haven't got that sort of muscle memory or that kind of intuition, it feels counterintuitive. It's like when people slam the brakes on when they're sliding in the snow or something and then they just spin off.
Yeah.
That thing of like, well, you might think, hang on, why didn't this happen or why didn't it happen? But it doesn't automatically mean it's wrong. And also, once you learn, you're better for it, and then you kind of grow in terms of your ability to handle these situations. And I think a lot of things like, developing circuits and everything else are all just a part of that. It's whether people are willing to, and this again goes back to the conversation you were making, John, about flight sims and stuff. Are people willing to invest the time and get the reward out of it, or do they just want the superficial I'm a hero straight off the bat experience? And there's people who fall in each category, and I think we all know which side we fall on that. And
I think the other thing at the moment in Sims is there's so much choice, as Tim was mentioning earlier. You don't have to persevere with the Lotus 49 in iRacing because you can go off and drive the MX-5 or something, because so if you're having that difficulty, taking the choice to commit to that car and learn it and put in, I'd honestly say you need a minimum of 3 hours in a car before you're going to be that confident with it, even a good car. But the Lotus 49, you probably need more than that, undoubtedly need more than that. And to get to the point where you're going to be very good and able to set the car up well and understand all of the setup adjustments and things like that, you're looking at 15 or 20 hours, and sticking with one car for that long, I don't think a lot of people do that. And in this post Gran Turismo era, where in Gran Turismo you're doing 3 or 5 lap races in a different car, every single race that you do you're jumping into something different, This profusion of choice is what people have become used to, and there is still a niche. There are still people like us, and there's still lots of people that are racing these historics and racing more niche, even non-historic cars that might be more tricky to get under the skin of. But I think the majority like to jump around. They like to jump in a car, not have to learn it, to literally be Michael Schumacher the moment they leap into that car and possibly winning everything, because they are indeed the finest racing driver that has ever graced the sport.
But just going back to the topic of wishlist sins, and one thing I was sort of thinking about was that, so like Rallycross is a series that I really like, and it's featured in a few titles, and just very recently there's been some content released on that. But it's never been covered, I'm pretty sure. It's never been included in a game in the way that, say, Tim, you were thinking about when you're talking about your wish list of, like, you know, it's this year and it's this series and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was almost thinking about a kind of parallel of how would I see Rallycross, say, implemented in a sim. And I was sort of, my mind went back to kind of the old Toka games, and certainly in Toka 2, I'm not so sure about Toka 1, where you have all the tracks and all the cars, the touring cars, and you have the support series and stuff. But what you would generally do when you play that is do a series. And so what you're doing is you could obviously just jump into hot laps or hot races or whatever, but basically you're committing yourself to saying, right, I'm going to do 10 races in this one car,
Yeah.
or whatever. And I was thinking, you know, so it's changed a bit Rallycross these days, but going back not all that long, the top tier used to have 3 divisions. You'd have like 1600 front wheel drive, you'd have 2 litre naturally aspirated rear wheel drive, and then you'd have 2 litre turbo 4-wheel drive. And I think, well, if you've got, say, 8 or 9 rounds in a series, you start in a 1600 car, I'm going to take a Clio, I'm going to take a Fiesta, whatever, and you do a series in that. You learn the tracks, you learn the format and the sport, as it were, and you're in a fairly easy car to drive, you know, relatively speaking. And during that, you learn and you grow and you develop. And then, but if you are just taking the approach of, oh, I'm going to take this car out and just do 5 minutes, and then I'll crash, I'll swap, and I'll do this and do that.
And you won't develop yourself as a driver, yeah.
Well, there's that, but you're never going to understand the car as well. And like you were just saying, it takes time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Hence my Forza Motorsports news title when they announced their 500 cars is that it's 500 cars you'll never master.
Yeah. Another point I wanted to mention on this, Simon, that sort of leads into both of these things, because it's a bit of a wishlist sim thing for me. It's a bit of game changer potential, and it also leads into what we were talking about a few months ago about persistence. Is that I think we've had this thing where we see the track as a living, breathing thing. It's time that the car became more of a living, breathing thing. And watching Le Mans last month, there was a point, I don't know, it was late, I was watching, and they were talking about the way the cars develop over the 24 hours. Mm-hmm. So that basically they were talking about the LMP2 cars at the time, and I think it was Alex Brundle, of course, who's raced out Le Mans in the LMP2 cars. So he was talking about how you're basically doing the life cycle of the engine in one full 24-hour stint. So for the rest of the season, they race 6-hour races, and they will expect to run the engine for 24 hours before replacing it. So throughout that specific race, they see the engine essentially losing horsepower as it goes. It's running its oil dry, and you know. Another thing he mentioned was that the dampers become jellified as the race goes on. So towards later in the race, you're finding that the car is much more bouncy and springy and bouncy. And he mentioned various other things, but essentially, and obviously the brakes as well. Brakes are something that modern sims are starting to do, especially Assetto Corsa Competizione with its endurance racing. Is already looking at this where the brakes will wear and you will have to change your brakes at certain pit stops and things like that. I think that we need to be looking at that as the next move forward. We've got the tracks to be more alive, especially when it comes to endurance racing. This needs to be more of a thing, but also I don't even know if it has to be restricted to endurance racing, because if you run like I am at the moment, the Lotus 79 in iRacing, and you run this week, next week, the week after, why can't that car be persistent and its brakes start to wear out as it gets to a certain point? I think what we talked about at the time was that maybe a sim needs a certain type of economy in there of either time or money or something that actually gives you some sort of penalty or reason. Like if I'm not in the middle of a race at a pit stop, then why? There's no penalty or issue to me changing brakes, so there's no point in it really. But fundamentally, the vehicle changes, and all of the parts in a vehicle age, and they develop and change as they age, and a car changes as it goes. We all know this from driving cars on the road. You know that when you're coming up to a service, if the dampers are feeling a bit squashy, or the brakes are feeling like they're running a bit low, and sure enough you take it in and they say, you're going to need to change all the shocks, mate. It's completely absent from sim racing, and especially when we were watching a couple of years ago in lockdowns, we were watching the virtual Le Mans 24 hours. They're driving around this brick of a car that it isn't changing over the course of that race, and the big feature of that race is to get the car to the end. But you've got this car that just is going to get to the end.
It makes me wonder if there's room for randomization too. I watched a podcast video from Dale Earnhardt Jr. He has a big podcast that he does, and he was talking about how an engine builder had given him one of his engines that he'd won a lot of races with, and he'd won with that engine because it was a special engine, where basically they'd put like the header and the pan from different engines together, and for some reason when they were all together on that engine, it did something special that they never were able to recreate, that had never come before, and it was built for a completely different kind of racetrack. It was built as like a short track engine, and it ended up winning most of his Talladega races on the the big super speedways. Obviously what that means is that there's a huge variation in engines the instant they're even built.
Yeah.
And that's missing from sim racing too, where basically you could line up on the starting grid next to another brand new car and they're completely different to you. Like we've probably all been to any kind of public sort of
rental karting. Somebody mentioned this to me the other day.
You always get the rubbish one.
Yeah. There's always a dud. There's always one that goes like a rocket. Yeah.
There's always some difference car to car, and the fact that in sim racing we have this fairness issue where everybody's expected to have digitally exactly the same vehicle. I wonder if there's room to not have exactly the same vehicle.
But maybe part of the gameplay could be involved in how well you look after that vehicle and how well you're tending to it.
Yeah, how high have you revved that engine compared to everybody else?
Yeah.
Just in the last week or so, I watched a video that John shared with me, and it was about flight simming and kind of the modelling of the internal sort of functions of the engine and stuff. And the guy who was talking about it was basically saying, you can do it by the numbers, but what are these numbers? What are these numbers in real life? And that's the thing. It's like you have stats. This is the capacity, this is the power. But it's like like you were saying, John, about a Le Mans engine through the race. At what point is that number the real number?
Yeah.
Really, this is a kind of living, evolving, dynamic thing with lots of bits interacting. As you say, Tim, there's you can get a dud part and it might fail. Is that fair? Well, it's realistic. And maybe there's a question here of, do you want to introduce things into your title that are perhaps worse than real life? Or no, sorry, they replicate real life, but actually you don't have to have them. And then there's a question mark of, well, are you chasing ultimate realism, or do you want to find some sort of balance where it's giving you the best possible experience, and perhaps there's some compromise there. I mean, I think I'm a bit indifferent to the idea of kind of randomized mechanical failures. You know, I think if a title had them and I got one, it'd be like, well, tough luck. As long as I could learn afterwards, was this because I did something wrong, or was it a random failure? So I know whether to learn from it and adapt or not. I think I could live with that. I also can imagine it's going to be a bit annoying if you're 1 hour 59 minutes into a 2-hour race that you practice that week for and then something goes. But again, that's what happens in real life, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, one of the major issues that I had with Grand Prix Legends is that I was flat shifting. I wasn't lifting or clutching when I was shifting when it first came out, and that was because I'd never had to do that before.
I don't feel the same about you now, Tim. I'll never look at you the same way.
Yeah, it's absolutely outrageous.
That was one of the things that Grand Prix Legends taught me.
I take it you didn't have your driving license at this point. Yeah. Okay.
No, I didn't. So yeah, I had never come across that before.
Do you have an interesting first driving lesson then, Tim?
Well, by the time I got my driver's license, I could drive pretty much anything because obviously I'd done a lot of simulation work at that point. But yeah, it kind of, I used to blow engines all the time in Grand Prix Legends, and it took me a disappointingly large amount of time to actually figure out that it was me that was causing that. And you know, in what you're saying, I think if you had failures that were your fault, I think that should be in every sim right now. You know, but if it's random, there's, you know, that's where the fairness factor comes in, because you could have one person be randomly the person that it happens to 10 times in a row, while you could have one other person randomly not have a failure 10 times in a row. You know, and that means that they would have to, you know, make sure that it's fair. And then what's the point, because it was fair before you did this?
Yeah, I think, you know, like in real motorsport, people say, you know, it evens itself out, right? For instance, you know, in 2016, Lewis Hamilton had more mechanical failures than Nico Rosberg, but in 2015 it was the other way around, you know. So these things even themselves out, but sometimes they don't, and sometimes people are just unlucky, right? And if you're in the sim, you're there going, why is it always me? But I seem to remember Crammond's Grand Prix 2 had this feature, and I had it enabled. I ran a full championship, I recall, and did suffer a couple of mechanical failures that were essentially randomised. And it was a little bit infuriating, but I mean, I think some of the best video games I've played have been known to be a bit infuriating. You know, the difficulty or the challenge.
Dark Souls type stuff.
Dark Souls, exactly, is a classic example. There are, you know, some boss that might just one hit you, and then, you know, then there's the other time you take them on and you're a bit luckier with that, and you got the swipe and you beat them. So there is an element of luck there with the, you know, random number generator. I think it would be more annoying in an online situation against other people than it is against AI in a sort of offline championship. But it'd be annoying either way. But at the end of the day, you know, this is how we learn to take it on the chin. It's annoying enough in online racing when somebody just runs into you, right?
On the kind of game changes thing and sort of being a bit more forward looking. One thing that I kind of saw a month or two back was this this demonstration of this kind of AI-driven real-time commentary by Inline 4. And it did get me thinking, you could imagine if you start introducing a lot more of this kind of complexity to the car modelling and stuff, and it would depend a bit on what series you're in, but you then opening yourself up to having perhaps AI engineer on the pit wall telling you need to be shifting lower RPM, or you could imagine having an AI mechanic who takes your car apart at the end and says, well, yeah, the reason you didn't finish, Tim, is because you were flat shifting every time, or something like that.
Yeah, it would have been helpful.
And I think you know, there's the sort of the scope for technologies like that to kind of complement the gaming experience are kind of massive. But I do think the one of the challenges when you start introducing the complexity to the car is then you have the question of, well, what do you do about that in the game? You know, are you going to have to go and click up? And we talked about this before, but it's like, you know, okay, your car's wearing out. What do you do about that? Or your car's getting damaged. What do you do about that? And I do think there's possibly a, you know, shy of your dream, Tim, which is having 20 friends join you as a virtual pit crew and stuff. Perhaps, you know, there's scope here for some AI driven or, you know, powered kind of functionality there that could give you sort of a slightly more dynamic feedback on the dynamic experience you're having.
Or a bit of both, you know, if you've only got 3 friends, then you get 3 friends to do do each role and whatever, and you have AI fill in the rest of the gaps.
Yeah, that's why I'm quite excited for the upcoming B17 games. You know, to go off at a complete tangent is because there's one that they're developing where you can play the VR part of one of the crew, and you can have 9 other friends play 9 other crew. So yeah,
I'm looking forward to the bit where we try and organise all 9 of us getting together.
Yeah,
all bit actually being available. We might be able to do it once.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that's about all we got time for today. It's been fun chatting, Simon and Tim. Tim, what's the best way for people to get in touch with Race Sim Central if they would like to ask questions?
Well, we're at racsimcentral.net. We have a website, forum. We're on Instagram. Everywhere else, you can obviously email. You should be able to find that in the info on wherever you're listening to this podcast. Or if not, you can use the contact form on the website or the forums. You can find us pretty much anywhere you want. Just search for Racing Central.
Jump on the old school forums and get the discussion moving, because it's not really been moving that much, has it?
Nope.
Okay, guys. Well, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.